everyone, I'm Dr Becky Appleton, and in this video in the series I'm going to give you an overview of how to do qualitative research. So to start with, what actually is qualitative research? So qualitative research generally refers to any research which aims to gather information on participants' thoughts, experiences and behaviours. It's often used to explore a phenomenon or to delve into the why or how of an area of study. For example, it can be really important to use qualitative research when you want to understand why an intervention might be working, and conducting qualitative methods might give you some more useful data than collecting more quantitative data. It generally involves collecting non-numerical data, for example, through interviews, photos, or observations of participants. It can be used to generate an in-depth understanding. And qualitative research can be conducted either alone or as part of a mixed method study. So this is where qualitative research is conducted at the same time as a quantitative project. For example, embedding qualitative research into a research trial, for example, when you're conducting a randomized control trial of a new intervention, can help you understand maybe why the intervention is working or isn't working in certain settings, staff's experiences of conducting this new treatment or this new intervention, and also participants' experiences of receiving this new intervention or type of care. Here are some examples of some good qualitative research questions. Firstly, how do adults with long-term conditions experience self-management support in primary care settings? Second, what are the lived experiences of older adults adapting to life after a major stroke? And thirdly, what are clinicians' perceived barriers and facilitators to delivering trauma-focused psychological therapies in NHS community mental health teams? What you can see from all of these questions is they're focusing on understanding people's experiences, either of a condition or of managing their illness, or also clinicians' experiences of why an intervention might be working or some challenges. Collecting this type of information can be really useful, as this then allows researchers to understand how to improve interventions in the future. These qualitative research questions are also worded slightly differently to quantitative research. Quantitative research is normally focused on trials or where you're collecting numerical data, and in that case it's really important to be as specific as possible in terms of the setting, the population, and the intervention that you're measuring as part of your research. However, qualitative research questions are generally broader, as you can see here. For example, what are the experiences of older adults is quite a broad question, and that's also quite a large population group. However, you would then normally go on to define this more in the rest of your research protocol. So, for example, you could specify that older adults is anybody over the age of 75. I'll now go on to talk a bit more about some other examples of qualitative research. Here are probably the main three methods of qualitative research. These are interviews, focus groups, and surveys. However, there are other things as well which can be used. For example, asking participants to write diary entries and analysing that data, or asking participants to take photos, for example. Sometimes qualitative research with younger children asks them to draw pictures or play as part of the qualitative data collection. This is all data that can be analysed. Interviews are probably the most commonly used qualitative method. This involves normally a one-on-one conversation where you would ask some certain questions about your topic of interest. This can be through a structured or semi-structured interview topic guide where you've decided on these questions in advance. The same goes for focus groups, although here you would normally expect to have around 4 to 10 participants per focus group, depending on your question. In terms of surveys, you would normally combine qualitative and quantitative questions in one questionnaire. But when analysing the written qualitative data, you could analyse this in the same way you would any other verbal qualitative data too. An example of a mixed method survey, for example, could be asking participants their experiences of an intervention, both in terms of Likert scales, where they choose from one of a multi-option question, but also free text boxes where they can write about their experiences and particular things they liked or disliked about it. When you're deciding on your interview, focus group or survey questions, it's really good practice to get some form of patient and public involvement, particularly from your group of interest. This ensures that any findings from your research will be relevant to this group. When thinking about sample sizes, it's really important to consider both the population and your research question. A general rule of thumb is anything between 10 and 20 interviews. This would be similar for focus group participants, although you would break these up into individual focus groups. You may want to have more participants if you're doing a survey. This is a potentially easier and less resource-intensive form of data collection. However, you may actually get less data per participant than if you're doing an interview. Therefore, it can be good practice to collect more survey data than you would need for interviews or focus groups. One final point here, when doing sampling for any of these methods, it's really important to try and get as diverse sample as possible. For example, if you're conducting interviews with staff working in a certain setting, it might be useful to make sure that you have staff working in different teams, from different professions or with different levels of seniority within your sample. It's also really important to take into account diversity and participant socio-demographic characteristics when recruiting for your qualitative research. Now, supposing you've collected your qualitative data and you want to think about how to analyse this. There are three most commonly used methods. The first is thematic analysis. So this allows you to generate themes from your data. This is done through an iterative process of coding and categorising your data. You would start off by coding small snippets of interview transcripts and then merging these together to create categories and ultimately themes. And I've got an example of how you will do this later on. Framework analysis is a similar approach. However, rather than coming up with the codes from the data itself, you code the data according to a pre-specified framework. This can be helpful if you have a certain theory about why something might or might not be working, or about people's experiences. Framework analysis is commonly used when you're working on research using something like an implementation science approach, where there might be pre-specified frameworks of barriers and facilitators to implementation that you can use to code and categorize your data. The final commonly used method is content analysis, and this is a method of categorizing qualitative data, so almost turning qualitative data into quantitative numerical data by counting instances of how many times certain things are brought up or how many participants mention a certain topic. I've got examples for all of these papers at the references slide at the end if you'd like to find out more information. Here is an example of coding some qualitative data. So this is completely fictional data from a participant in a study exploring the lived experiences of older adults adapting to life after a major stroke. You can see that the interviewer has asked one quite broad question: can you tell me how things have changed? In the respondent's answer, you can see that they've mentioned lots of different things, both comparing between their life now and their life before the stroke, how they feel physically, things like the impact this has had on using their arm or walking, and also needing help with certain activities. They've also mentioned the emotional impact this has had and said that it's frustrating. In the boxes at the side, you can see that I've coded all of these different aspects of this snippet of one transcript. This has given me 5 different codes just from this one paragraph. You would do this through the rest of the transcript and then also take a similar approach for any other participant transcripts in your study. Once you've got these codes, you can then merge them to create categories and then themes. For example, I'll show you in the next slide. Here you can see 2 potential themes you might get from this study data. Theme 1 is around reliance on others, and categories that could come under this theme are points around needing support with activities, reduced independence, not being able to drive, and needing help with daily tasks. The second theme focuses on the emotional impacts of the stroke, for example around feeling frustrated, having a low mood, or feeling like a burden. This example shows how you can go from the line-by-line coding to developing overarching themes from your data. This is an example of thematic analysis. If you were to do this as a framework analysis, you would start with the codes and themes to begin with, and then categorize your data under these codes. And here is another example, using fictional data from an interview study exploring the use of digital tools in medical education. Again, you can see that the interviewer has asked a fairly open-ended question. Can you tell me about a time when a digital tool changed how you learnt something in clinic? And below you can see the participant's response. Similar to the last example, I've used line-by-line coding to code different excerpts from this transcript. You can see these codes on the right-hand side and at the bottom of this slide. These codes include things like skepticism, where the participant said they were skeptical of these virtual patient simulations at first. And also this implies changing opinion, saying they were skeptical at first, but then this changed their mind. There are also a couple of instances where they've compared these novel methods with more traditional teaching methods. For example, in saying that this stuck with them more than a textbook explanation. Here you can see that it's perfectly fine to code things more than once. For example, this last line has also been coded benefits of digital methods. Once you have your codes, you can then group these into categories in order to generate your themes. So here is a slightly more in-depth example. Codes such as benefits of digital methods and enhanced learning could be merged together in a category called advantages over traditional teaching methods. Once you have your categories, you can then go about combining these into themes. A theme in qualitative research is a higher level integrative idea that captures an important aspect of the data in relation to your research question or research questions. A theme can be made up of one or more categories. So using the previous example, the categories advantages over traditional teaching methods and active learning benefits could be merged into a theme entitled Digital Tools Enhance Learning through Immediate Feedback and Active Engagement. This is a fairly long and descriptive theme title, and whilst this is perfectly fine, you may want to rename this into something a bit snappier and a bit more engaging. Here are a few additional tips for thematic analysis. Firstly, you may move back and forth between coding, categorizing, and theme building during your data analysis. For example, it may be that when you're categorizing your codes, you may think, actually, it makes sense if I go back and make these a bit more detailed, or actually, I can combine these codes because they're saying the same thing. Your themes should say something new, not just be a relabel of categories. So this is where you want to group your categories together and interpret them in a way that helps to answer your research question. Name your themes clearly, aiming for short, evocative titles that convey meaning. For example, technology as tutor and trap is something which really clearly conveys the content of that theme. Your themes should also directly relate to your research question. The themes will make up the findings part of your research project, so they should be answering the research question you set at the beginning. And finally, each theme should make sense internally, where all the codes and categories within it are coherent and be distinct from others. There can be some overlap between themes. However, it should be clear to the reader why some content is presented in one theme rather than another. Finally, here's the pros and cons of the qualitative method. It can be a really useful method to find out more about how people can experience certain procedures or aspects of care. And it can help you answer why things are happening, rather than just the impact of an intervention, which you might find out from a typical quantitative analysis. For example, if you're conducting a qualitative study alongside a randomized control trial, but you're struggling to recruit numbers, you could do some qualitative research to work out why the take-up of an intervention is low. You also only need to recruit a smaller number of participants than if you're doing quantitative research. For example, if you're conducting interviews, a maximum of 20 participants will generate more than enough data for a good quality qualitative study. However, as qualitative research tends to be broader and with smaller numbers, it can lack the ability to generate broader conclusions. For example, if you've recruited 20 people as part of your interview study, you don't know that you would get the same findings if you interviewed a different 20 people in a different part of the country. Whilst this is often mentioned as a criticism of qualitative research, I think that is a bit unfair, as really the aim of qualitative research isn't to go into the breadth of a topic. Instead, its strength is in the depth that you're able to explore a certain field. And finally, when it comes to analysing qualitative data, this can be really affected by researcher biases. Therefore, taking a reflexive stance as a researcher is really important, as well as involving people with lived experience to ensure that any findings are relevant to the patient population that you're studying. Here are the 3 references for the 3 main types of qualitative analysis if you'd like to find out about any of these in more detail. You can see the direct link on screen to the catalogue hosted on the NHS Learning Hub platform. Registration is free, and if you have an NHS email, you'll have free access to both the Learning Hub as a whole and the WE-R NHS catalogue resources. We have links to podcasts, videos, journal articles on a range of topics related to education and workforce research. WE-R NHS is also on YouTube, and we have a regular e-newsletter. Thanks very much for watching.